Hi, I'm Steve Baird, the director of the Klein Historical Foundation, and we're standing right now in the Corville Schoolhouse. This was actually the last African-American schoolhouse used in the Klein community to 1966. Now, many of you don't know what Wunderlich Farm or the Klein, Texas Museum really is, and really what it is, it's a repository of local history for this area. The first settlers started coming to this area in the 1820s, and they were French families, and then the 1830s with the Scottish, and the 1840s to about the 1900s with a mass German migration. And the Wunderlich Farm actually sits on 8 acres of the original Wunderlich homestead that Johann Peter Wunderlich bought back in 1854. And with those 8 acres, we have 4 or 5 houses actually preserved in their original states. We have the original house of the property, and then we have the Klein Hildebrand house, and we have the Corville Schoolhouse, and we have the Maria Katharina Hophius Wunderlich house, as well as the John Tice house. Now, each of those houses in itself is a museum. It's a time capsule, so to speak, all decked out in different periods throughout time, stretching from the 1880s up to about the 1940s, 1950s. And it's my job to record those histories of our founding families. Whether it's stories, preserve their photographs, preserve farm implements, preserve textiles and clothing, blankets, quilts. So we have close to about 100,000 artifacts on site, from tax receipts to documents to immigration papers to birth certificates, confirmation certificates. So it's my job to, as a museum director and a curator really, to preserve those documents in their state so that they can last forever for future generations to enjoy. Every 4th grader in Klein ISD comes through on a 2-hour field trip out here, and that's 32, almost 33 elementary schools, almost 4,100 4th graders. We are only one of 4 school districts that own and operate its very own living history museum. Being a nonprofit, we're not financed by the district per se, so operational costs and curational costs are raised solely on grants, donations, and festivals. We host a big farmers market the last Saturday of every month. We do a big Christmas festival, a fall festival, a spring festival. So we have a big job ahead of us, and it's preserving not just the buildings and the artifacts that are in the buildings, but it's preserving all the backstories and the histories that go to each and every one of these families. Now, a lot of you may be wondering, exactly how did all this get started? Well, back in the 1820s, when we were still part of Mexico, they were giving away large swaths of land. And back in the 1820s, 1830s, we had about 13 French families that headed this way over from the New Orleans area and started settling in what we call the Klein and the Willow Creek area. Following that up, we had some Scottish immigrants coming in, the Mahaffeys, the McDougals. And then starting around the 1840s, we saw a huge mass immigration of the German families. And a lot of them were coming over here because of religious persecution in Germany. They were coming here to get away from the civil wars that were going on all over. They were also coming for land. There wasn't enough land, and we know from one of the letters written by Johann Peter Wunderlich that in order to cut timber down in Germany, you had to be aristocracy or nobility. And here he wrote that there's enough lumber and timber for anybody to cut down. And so that was a big selling point for a lot of these families to take or uproot and come this way and start settling in Texas. One of the first German families were the Tice family, and Johann Heinrich Tice started coming this way. I think he immigrated around 1846, that ballpark, and they actually settled over in the Rose Hill, the Tomball area. And then Jakob, his oldest son, Jacob, came over here to the Klein area and started taking up residence here and farming. Matter of fact, really close to where we are today. The land we sit on now, while it's called Wunderlich Farm, was originally a Tice property. And Jacob sold it over to Johann Peter Wunderlich in 1854, and he sold him 120 acres for $175. And then we had Mr. Klein come in. Mr. Klein started coming this way in the 1850s, and he actually went up through St. Louis first, headed over to California for the gold rush, came back through South America, met his wife in New Orleans, and then came over here to Galveston. He was actually on his way to a different part of the state when the rains kind of washed out the roads, and he lost some money from theft down in Houston proper. And the families convinced him to come up this way. And Adam Klein came up here, and he bought land, about 600 acres, for 33.3 cents an acre. And then come the 1880s, he actually petitioned the government for a post office. Up to this point, this whole area was known as Big Cypress. Wasn't even called Klein yet, it was Big Cypress, based on the creeks. And on the point of the form where it says name of town, he left it blank. And so the government, in its infinite wisdom, decided to name it Klein after the gentleman who was asking for it. And from that point on, we've been called Klein, Texas. We're sitting right now on the porch of what we call the Maria Catherine house. Maria Catherine Hophius, here she is right here, married Johann Peter Wunderlich shortly after they got here. It's funny to note there's a letter that Johann wrote back to his parents, and he asked, I know you're probably wondering about the housekeeper I'm living with. He said, but we got married because we decided that you can do nothing on your own without a good wife with you. And so he married Maria Catherine Hophius, and then in 1854, they bought the 120 acres that made up Wunderlich Farm from Jacob Tice. Now, Maria Catherine Hophius Wunderlich was a very strong woman. She had 5 kids initially, and then while she was pregnant with her 6th child, her husband, Johann Peter Wunderlich, was conscripted into the Confederate Army. Most of our Germans didn't agree with the Civil War. They didn't own slaves. They wanted nothing to do with it. Remember what I said earlier? They left Germany to get away from the Civil Wars, not to be in another one. But the Southern states didn't care, and so they conscripted him. And if you could show yourself valuable to the war effort without going to the front line, you could stay. And so Mr. Wunderlich actually worked in a gunpowder plant over in what we called then Peck, Texas. Today you might call it Tomball. Well, he worked in that gunpowder plant, and unfortunately one night they didn't wet down the gunpowder enough or something, and it caught fire and it blew up. It killed 3 people, and then Johann Peter Wunderlich was burned over 80% of his body, and he died the next day. Now remember, Maria was pregnant with her 6th child. Her husband dies. 2 months later, she gives birth to her 6th and final child, a little boy, and she named him Peter in honor of her late husband. Now back in that time, in 1864, most of the women, if their husband passed away, which was not uncommon due to their lifestyle, they would remarry within the year in order to have somebody to help care for their kids as well as the homestead. Well, Maria Catherine didn't get remarried. She kept her 6 kids together, continued farming her land, raised enough money that in 10 years after that moment had this house built and designed by an architect from Houston. So that in itself is phenomenal. Her 2 sons maintained the property, William, her oldest boy, and then Peter, her youngest, and continued to farm and provide for the family. And this is the house where she eventually passed away in 1903, 1904 at the age of 73, living with her son William and her daughter-in-law Wilhelmina. When we talk about strong women in our district, nobody else exemplifies that as much as Maria Catherine Hophius Wunderlich right here. Not only is this a great place of learning for our students, but the Peter Wunderlich house that we're standing on right now actually received the National Register of Historical Places. We are on the register because this house right here has never moved. Now remember, a lot of these families left Germany to create a better life. And a lot of these families came with nothing but a steamer trunk full of clothing, a few personal items, knowing that none of them would ever make it back to see moms and dads, family that they left behind in Germany, and they struck out here with the spirit of adventure and the spirit for a better way of life. And that is exactly what we excel for here at Klein ISD. Many of these founding families are still working right here. Not only did they found a community built on trust, built on hard work, but they founded a school district that still bears their name today. And their names are immortalized not just in the history books and the stories that we tell here at the museum, but within the naming of each of our elementary, high school, and intermediate campuses. We honor their legacy, we honor their history as they still work for the district, as they continue about their everyday lives. And Klein ISD is a place that embraces that culture, embraces that heritage. Klein ISD strives to make a better today by studying and embracing the history of yesterday.